Okay, let's begin. Today we're going to switch gears a bit and start talking about chemistry. I know nobody's a fan of chemistry, and I'm at the top of the list. However, if you're interested in health and nutrition, which probably a lot of you are, it turns out that a little bit of chemistry is very helpful. So we're going to try and cover it just from the perspective of what is going to help you out in your life. Before we started, though, I wanted to read something. A former TA from my class sent me something, and I thought this was great. This was an article from the editors of Cooks Illustrated, some magazine, and what they did was they evaluated all the different ingredients that you use in various things you might bake, including cookies. And they said here, they describe, what to do with eggs, nuts, salt, etc. And we get down to vanilla extract. And here's what they say about vanilla extract. When we tested vanilla extract several years ago, the results were so shocking we repeated the test again and again, most recently in November 2003. In every test, we found that people, including pastry chefs, can't tell the difference between a cookie made with true vanilla extract and a cookie made with the imitation extract, which is derived from wood pulp. How great is that? I love that they did the experiment. They didn't like. They were surprised, so they did it again. They do it again. At some point, you have to then just believe it. Someone, though, I don't have it here, but someone else brought me something that I thought, oh yeah, here it was. No, I do have it. I tended to make the conclusion after I talked about the vanilla extract experiments. I think I said to you, there is no taste difference between artificial vanilla extract and vanilla extract. But then someone did some experiments where they looked at things like plain custard. This is another dessert that has a lot of vanilla extract in it. And it says some tasters can detect differences in a plain custard. But in a cookie, the quantity of vanilla is so small and the other ingredients are so flavorful that the subtle variations in vanilla flavor can't be detected. So actually then someone says, this is exactly how the scientific method works. They said your conclusion was appropriate but not as broadly as you thought. You have to be more specific because if you test artificial and real vanilla in custard, there is a difference. So I can say in chocolate chip cookies, artificial vanilla extract tastes the same as real vanilla extract, but in things where vanilla makes up a bigger proportion of the ingredients, then I can't say that. So something about that I find really satisfying. Here was another article in the paper. This was earlier this year. This was in May. But I thought it was interesting, again, because it was someone trying to take the scientific method and apply it to a field that traditionally wouldn't have the scientific method applied to it. And here's what it was called. The article was this from the New York Times. Study of NBA refs sees racial bias in calling fouls. Coming paper by a University of Pennsylvania professor says that during 13 seasons from 1991 through 2004, white referees called fouls at a greater rate against black players than against white players. Blah, blah, blah. It goes on and on. They found a corresponding bias in which black officials called fouls more frequently against white players, though that tendency was not as strong. They went on to claim that the different rates at which fouls are called is large enough that the probability of a team winning is noticeably affected by the racial composition of the refereeing crew assigned to the game. This turned out to be very controversial because people, if that's true, that was a big deal. But if it wasn't, if something in their methods meant that it wasn't a perfectly accurate way of drawing this conclusion, they should go back and redo it. So the debate has been ongoing. There's one guy on some Fox Sports here, goes on and on. This is his article. He says, let's see, I did a 7-minute study of Wolfers and Price that consisted of reading 2 stories, one in the New York Times, the other on the AP, and reached this conclusion. Justin Wolfers and Joseph Price are colossal idiots, and their schools should be embarrassed. Then he goes on and on. He goes through one by one, and he talks about ways that their methods were not actually that good, that they couldn't tell. They were looking at these box scores where they didn't know if there were some white refs, some black refs. They didn't know who had made the call and so on. And he poked a bunch of holes that said, hey, maybe this would be interesting, but you'd have to go back and you would have to do A, B, and C. And currently, I believe people actually are going back and they're trying to redo it with a more rigorous scientific method. So it's everywhere. Okay, so today, because we want to learn about food and health, we're going to look at the different types of biological macromolecules, lipids, carbohydrates, and proteins, and talk about them. What is it about their features, their chemical features, that makes them either tasty or not tasty? What makes them something desirable in our diet or not desirable? And the first one we'll talk about are called lipids. And lipids, it's bizarre. We'll see with other molecules, it's very easy to define what they are. Lipids are just defined as molecules that are not water soluble. They have a couple of other features. Going back here, I love this picture. This is from Namibia, and it's a place called the Sands of Hell. And it gets so foggy, and the tide moves in so much and out so much that ships come in too close because they can't see where they are. The fog goes out, the tide goes out, and you have ships all over the place just deserted in the sand here. Unrelated to today's lecture, though, but I liked it. So sue me. Okay, so we define them as being not water soluble. They're major storehouses of energy as molecules, and we'll see why. They're also good insulators. So you see animals that either spend a lot of time in the water but are trying to maintain a higher body temperature, or animals that spend a lot of time in places where the climate's really cold, tend to have a lot of lipids in their body composition here. This is an elephant seal. They're actually very good singers. No, I'm kidding. This was a guy, though, recording vocalizations, but they have a lot of lipids on them as part of their insulation. Here are a couple of males fighting, and we're actually going to talk a lot about elephant seals later on. There's some interesting features of their biology. In humans, they also can serve as storage of energy. We'll see that there are three different types. People tend to use the words fats and lipids interchangeably. Sometimes I will, but that's not exactly right. Lipids are the general category. Fats and triglycerides are the primary dietary type that you use for energy and for, as I said, insulation. But we've also got phospholipids. I'll spend just a minute on those. And steroids as well. Things like testosterone, estrogen are also lipids. So they aren't water soluble and so on. Anyway, so let me show you what they look like. And you don't have to worry here about the specifics of the molecule, but there are a couple of features that will come out anytime you see a diagram. So here would be what a molecule of a lipid looks like. When you see them, there are going to be a lot of complicated things. I would like you to write this one down. Sorry, I won't make you write any more down, but they have two parts. They have something called a glycerol. This is if we talk about a triglyceride. And then they have three fatty acids. So you have C stands for carbon, H stands for hydrogen. So a carbon and two hydrogens attached to it, attached to another one, attached to another one. And then they have these long chains that go, there's some messy stuff up here, carbons, oxygen. But then they go CH2, a carbon with two hydrogens attached, to CH2, to CH2, to CH2, to CH2, 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 all the way down. That is called a hydrocarbon tail because all it is hydrogen, and carbon. And the connections between all those bonds, if you were to break them apart, energy gets released. This is why they are such good storage molecules for energy, because that's a lot of bonds that you can break and release some energy. And that energy can help you to do useful things like walking around or talking or thinking. Other molecules that also are hydrocarbons, things like gasoline. Very similar structure. You've got this long connection of CH2, 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 And when you burn gasoline, what you're doing is breaking these bonds. The energy that's released pushes against the piston in your car, turns the crankshaft, turns the wheels, and you move forward. So it's not just analogous, it's even more similar than that to using food that you consume if there are lipids extracting the energy from that. There are 17 carbons in a molecule called stearic acid that's attached here, and here's stearic acid, and if we attached another stearic acid, sorry, you can ignore this molecule here, and it would be called, this lipid would be called tristearin, because there are 3 stearic acids all connected together. There are lots of different lipids that are in your diet. They don't all have the 17 carbons. Some of them might have 15. Some of them might have a stearic acid, and then something with 14 carbons, and then something with 22 carbons. I'm not going to care about the specifics. I would never ask you, what is this lipid? What is this lipid? What is this lipid? But I might expect you to be able to look at something like that and say, ha-ha, I see a bunch of hydrocarbon tails somehow attached together with a handle on the top. I think that those will release a lot of energy. When they're broken, this is probably a lipid. For what we've been doing in this course so far, the first few weeks, I would say that Mean Genes has been more helpful in terms of the material. For the next week or so, the stuff in the textbook, sometimes it's really helpful, sometimes it's not as helpful. It's pretty good on this stuff. So I would, the Campbell book, I would focus on that for a lot of this. You'll get a little bit of background. You may have taken high school chemistry. I'll assume that you don't remember any of it. Okay, there's a question somewhere, right?
The green thing?
Oh, so the green thing here, I was just showing that you take something called stearic acid, that it has this molecule, this, like I said, just some stuff up here, and then the primary thing of interest, all the CH2s, and then you attach it to glycerol, just this other molecule that's like a handle, and in order to attach it, you take this molecule goes away, this one goes away, this one goes away, and so when you make lipids, water comes off. H2 and an O. So they're actually connected. The dotted line just says you can start with them not connected, and you can build the fatty acid.
And is that H2?
What's that? H2C right there. The reason I did it differently there is you'll see these abbreviated. They're written in a shorthand, CH2, CH2, but it's not CH2 isn't a molecule. It's carbon attached to carbon, attached to carbon, attached to carbon, and then sticking out. Carbon has 4 things usually attached to it, and so you've got it's attached to the previous carbon, it's attached to the next carbon, and then the 2 other spaces are hydrogens that come out. So if I wanted to really be accurate, I would draw it like this, C attached to C attached to C, and there would be an H there and an H there. So I've just abbreviated CH2 or sometimes H2C. It's the same thing. It's a carbon with 2 hydrogens attached. So this isn't complete because, again, this C needs to have 4 things attached. So I might say, all right, well, here we'll add another H, and up here we'll add another H. So then that would be CH3, CH2, CH3. But as I said, all we care about the chemistry here is how is it relevant to your life. And we're going to see that when you eat lipids, they have lots and lots of energy that can be extracted from them. And that is all about carbon connected to carbon, connected to carbon, connected to carbon, and so on, and breaking those down. Okay, so if you think about fatty acids in your diet, the big distinction that you would ever hear anywhere in the media would be saturated versus unsaturated. And even if you've never thought about chemistry, everybody knows the difference between these two, right? One type is good, one type is bad. Which type is good? Unsaturated. And by good, I mean less bad. They're still pretty bad. If you're trying to minimize how much you weigh. But we start out, just to break down that stearic acid that we were looking at before, every fatty acid has something at the top that's going to allow it to connect to that glycerol, which was the handle. And then it's got this. It's got some polar means that it is something it can mix with water relatively well. Non-polar means doesn't like to mix with water. The hydrocarbon tail, CH2, 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 doesn't like to mix with water. But here are two different ways you can do it. So all those are CH2s. But on this one right here, instead of CH2, CH2, I still have carbon connected to carbon connected to carbon. But sometimes you have what's called a double bond. So those carbons bind, so the 4 bonds that carbon usually forms, 2 of them now are with the adjacent carbon, and there aren't as many hydrogens attached to it. So because carbon always has 4 bonds, if you have just individual bonds between the carbons, then you have to have 4 total, so single bond, single bond, single bond, single bond. But you could get rid of one of these, and now this carbon has to have an extra bond, and so what you do is you would have an extra bond there instead of the C. So these would be 2 ways that you could have carbon, 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 carbon. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I could add another one there. And saturated or unsaturated refers to, have you packed as many hydrogens onto that hydrocarbon as possible? And on this one, the answer would be no. You haven't packed as many hydrogens there as possible, because you could get rid of this double bond, have it just be a single bond, in which case this carbon here and this carbon here, they would each get an extra hydrogen. So there aren't as many hydrogens as there could be. So the question of a saturated or unsaturated fat solely refers to the fact of whether or not there are any double bonds in the hydrocarbon tail. So here might be an example, something called oleic acid. You can get that in some foods that you eat. Oleic acid has 1 double bond. Each of the lines, people use shorthand in chemistry because they don't want to write CH2, 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 CH2. Here we have written it. And here, because it's not CH2, you write CH. Got to have double bond, CH. So there aren't as many H's as there could be. So that would be unsaturated. And in fact, this would be called monounsaturated because there is 1 double bond. If you had more double bonds, you can have things that are polyunsaturated. The more unsaturated they are, the better they are from a health perspective. The reason that unsaturated fats tend to be better from a health perspective is that when you are saturated, and these are lined up like this, the hydrocarbon tails line up really tightly next to each other, and they can be packed in very dense, and it makes it hard for your body to have enzymes to get in there and to break them apart. In order to extract energy from the triglyceride, you have to get an enzyme in there. You have to break the bonds. But if the molecules of your body that pull things apart can't reach them, they just sit there and they don't get broken down. You don't extract the energy from them. They get shoved into a fat cell in your body somewhere, and they just sit there. Unsaturated fats, on the other hand, because you have this double bond here, causes it, instead of going dun, 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 and packing together tightly, it's like dun, 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 and they have these kinks in the tail, and it sticks it out so that they can't pack together quite so tightly. And when they can't pack together tightly, your body can get enzymes in there, and it's like, aha, now we can get a good grip on it. We can rip it apart. When we rip it apart, we get energy. And so your body is more likely to use them for energy, less likely to store them. And if you're not storing the fat, then that usually is better off from a health perspective. Got a picture of butter here, some margarine, some oil. The important dietary thing is that most animal fats, like butter, lard, bacon grease, fats that come from animals tend to be saturated, almost always. When they're saturated, they tend also to be solid at room temperature. Most plant fats, most fish fats as well, they're the one exception of the animals. Most fish and plant fats tend to be unsaturated, and they tend to be liquid at room temperature. So you've got something here. Canola oil, or you might have corn oil, any kind of vegetable oil. They are unsaturated, and they're liquid at room temperature. Butter, going to be solid at room temperature, and they're both still lipids, and they both still carry lots of energy, stored energy, but one of them is going to be a little bit easier to break down than the other. This is why in making cookies, what I will do, the recipe calls for butter. I will use half butter and half oil. And you're still putting lipids into the cookies, but what I'm doing is I'm taking lots of the saturated fats that would be there in the cup of shortening that they want, and I'm saying I'm only going to put half a cup of fully saturated fats. The other half cup I'm going to put unsaturated, and you can make your cookies slightly healthier. Not only that, because the unsaturated fats are liquid at room temperature, they make your cookies a little bit more moist. If you use all oil instead of butter, they're even more healthy, but they tend to get a little bit too floppy. And so you can find a happy medium, which is going to help you in answering this cue here. I say, snack foods tend to contain partially hydrogenated vegetable oils. Why? As you're writing that down, I'll explain why I came up with this question. As a kid, sort of as a grown-up as well, I loved data. I just wanted to read everything I could. I'd sit there in the morning looking at the cereal box, reading every possible thing on it, and it occurred to me once, I was fairly precocious. I was maybe 8 or 9 years old, and someone asked me what my favorite food was. And because I had been reading food labels my entire life, everything I had, any kind of food I would eat, I would read the food label. And I loved the fact, even as a little kid, I thought this was the coolest thing, that the ingredient list had to be in order of how much they had of each ingredient. So I got all this data by reading it. But they asked me, what's your favorite food? And I said, partially hydrogenated vegetable oil. I didn't know what that meant, but I knew that all the foods I loved most, that was the first ingredient on them. What are the things that you eat that say partially hydrogenated vegetable oil?
Peanut butter.
Peanut butter is one of them. I love that. What?
Oreos.
Oreos, yes. Cookies, possibly my favorite. Candy bars, things like that. That was, for me, it was most of it, I think, was cookies, candy bars. It wasn't until many, many years later that I investigated further, thinking, what do they mean partially hydrogenated? What do they mean vegetable oil? I'm eating a vegetable when I eat a cookie. Should I get credit from my parents? So what's going on here? Well, I just told you that vegetable oils tend to be unsaturated. So hydrogenating something means adding hydrogen atoms to it. And I said that saturated fats are when you've added as many hydrogens to that hydrocarbon tail as possible. So why would you add hydrogens to this unsaturated fat? We already know the unsaturated fat is better. What would you get by adding them?
Would it maybe affect the taste?
It definitely affects the taste. But what else? It solidifies. Because remember I said that the animal fats that are fully saturated are solid. The vegetable unsaturated fats are liquid. Now, if I'm making a candy bar, do I really want it to be a liquid candy bar? That doesn't work so well. On the other hand, what if I add just enough hydrogen so it's liquid, but all solids can melt at some temperature? And if you're on that border of solid, but you really don't want to be solid, you're on the verge of melting, what happens? As soon as you raise the temperature by 1 or 2 degrees, they melt. Well, where's the temperature 1 or 2 degrees higher? In your mouth. So what they can do is they can tinker with the food. They can start with something that's liquid. They can one by one add hydrogens and then say, okay, now try it now. Is it melting in your mouth but not in your hands? It's like, no, it's melting all over my hands, which are also a little bit warmer than just the shelf that they're sitting on. And so what they would do is little by little find out how much do we have to hydrogenate it so that we can get the optimum texture of the chocolate usually.
Why not just use butter?
Why not use butter? Primarily because vegetable oils are cheaper. And it turns out that when you hydrogenate them, they last forever. There's something about the position that the hydrogens get added on that they become even more stable and less likely to break down. Less likely to break down, which is kind of bad because once they're in your body, you sort of want to break them down. So I would say, why might it be desirable? Because you can create exactly the texture you want. You can do it relatively inexpensively. They have better shelf life. Yes?
So in addition to whether it's solid or liquid, is there anything to do with how long it keeps for?
Yeah, so that's what I was saying. It causes them to keep much, much, much longer. And if you're in the food industry and you're building some cookies, you know that they've got to be built at your factory, they have to be packaged, and then they have to be shipped, and you don't know how long they're going to sit on the shelf. So all those things tend to to cause them to last longer and be better from their perspective. That's why if you are a big food-making company versus me, you have different reasons why you might want to use that. I don't care what the shelf life is of a cookie in my house because it's not going to last that long, if somebody's going to eat it. The less desirable consequences, it just so happens that when you take these vegetable oils, and what they do is they take hydrogen gas and they bubble it up through a vat of the vegetable oil, and at some point, the hydrogens get absorbed into it. It tends to add them not in exactly the same conformation as they would normally. So I've got them drawn in here just as, they're off to the left side and off to the right side. But there are subtle variations. Does this go slightly up or does it go slightly down? And this is where you've heard of things like trans fats. They can be in two positions, trans or cis. And most of the natural animal fats are going to be in the cis position, which is a little bit easier to break down. So the act of hydrogenating your vegetable oil can make it even more stable than the original saturated fats. So trans fats are considered really bad dietarily because they're the hardest of all to break down. All right, I mentioned that not only do we have lipids, we've got, not only do we have fats and triglycerides, which are, the dietary, the things we're going to eat, but we've also got phospholipids and hormones. I don't want to spend too much on this because I'm interested in chemistry mostly in how it relates to nutrition, but because they're so common and you'll hear them mentioned occasionally. Phospholipids are built like this. You take two fatty acids, so these are long tails. They're hydrophobic, meaning they don't like to mix with water. You connect them to the glycerol, so in our fats and triglycerides we talked about, this is like the handle at the top. This part is hydrophilic, meaning it will mix with water. Then they add over here, instead of making it a triglyceride, you just have two tails, and then you add something that has phosphorus. The molecule ends up now, we draw it shorthand as it's got some stuff up here, and it has two little tails. That is called a phospholipid. I only mention it because every cell in your body is contained within a membrane, and the membranes are made out of these phospholipids. So all throughout your body, the thing that keeps what's in your cells in and keeps the stuff out of it is a molecule that looks like this. And so you can take these molecules, as I told you, this part mixes with water, this part doesn't like to mix with water. So if you take a bunch of phospholipids and you throw them together, here's what they do. If they're in water, they all orient themselves so the outside part is in contact with the water and the inside is not in contact with water. And if there's something like oil in it as well, they would have all of their fatty acid tails would be in contact with the oil. And this turns out to be a good way to clean your clothes, because if you have things on your clothes like oil and you take a bunch of phospholipids and you put them on them, they see that and they all want to orient part of themselves, the part that is hydrophobic, around the oil. They like to be there chemically. And the other part is around water, so if you then rinse it off, it takes the oil and it washes away with it. So laundry detergents are made out of these phospholipids. And in your cells, because there's mostly water outside the cell, mostly water inside the cell, here's what happens. They orient so that you have a phospholipid and a phospholipid, and they put their part that doesn't like to be next to water next to each other and the part that likes to be next to water there, and they form an entire ring around the cell so that you've got water inside the cell, water outside the cell. But it tends not to pass through very easily because it would have to go through this green region where the tails are that is hydrophobic, and it doesn't want to do that. And so your cells can build in other little secret passageways there that can serve as channels to get stuff into the cell or out of the cell. So here's a close-up of part of a cell, and if you look around the edges, it's a double line because you have phospholipid, phospholipid, so there are two layers of them. Question? Sure. Can I put the previous one back up? That was this one. Question?
Yeah. Someone told me a while ago, I mean, this kind of pertains to this, but that the right way to just, like, diet, I guess, is not to use margarine, it's just to use butter, because evolutionary, like, you know how to process butter more than you do margarine.
So it's a good question. If you're trying to lose weight, should you focus on something that is natural, that maybe your body is better adapted to breaking down, versus something that isn't? No good answer on there. People are really split. On the one hand, yeah, our bodies are pretty good at breaking down animal fats. On the other hand, margarines tend to just be made with vegetable oils, and we're pretty good at breaking them. We've been evolving in a world with vegetables as well. And so it's unclear that one is better than the other. The one has slightly more unsaturated fat, so it's a little bit better. Probably the best thing is to avoid both of them because they're both very high in calories. All right, so I had that up there. So our first, I can't even get to our first take-home message. We got one more. I'm not going to spend any time on this at all. Steroids, just for the sake of completeness, steroids are lipids, but they all have this same structure. And I put a couple of these up here, not, as I said, because I'm going to have you regurgitate a bunch of chemical structures, but because every now and then you'll see a molecule or a molecular structure. And if you happen to see something like this that sort of looks like the Olympics, we've got these 4 rings. It's not 5 rings, but it's 4 rings interlocked. Those are lipids. So every one of these lines, like our hydrocarbon tail before, is a C connected to 2 hydrogens, CH2, unless they have something else. So here's a carbon connected to an H and an O. But if you have these 4 rings, that means it's a lipid, and it means it's a steroid. I've written down cholesterol here and testosterone just to show you how similar they are. The testosterone in your body gets manufactured from cholesterol that you consume. It gets modified slightly, but they're pretty similar to each other. We'll talk more about steroid hormones in about 3 weeks when we talk about testosterone and estrogen and how they influence your behavior, but we're not going to do any more here. I will never have you draw a structure, so I'm just putting it up there for you to see what they look like. Okay. So our first take-home message is this. that lipids are defined as water-insoluble molecules. Their primary thing, when I say lipids, you should think energy storage. And if you have any extra memory left over, think membranes and as hormones. But all I really care about is this. Lipids are important in energy storage. The second thing that I want to talk about here today is this question, and we write about this in Mean Genes in the chapter on fat. But it's a bigger issue than just lipids. It's about food in general, and it's a question of why would we have food preferences? And what does it even mean to have a food preference? This is one of those things that's so intuitive that we just take it for granted. Well, you know, some food tastes good, other food doesn't taste good. And it would never even occur to us to eat dirt, right? Because we think, well, that's not food. And what do we mean by it's not food? You can put it into your mouth. It has molecules, probably has some carbons, probably has some hydrogens. But we don't call it food, and it sure doesn't taste very good. So let's think about this, what it means for a food to taste good, and in particular, why it is that fats would taste good. Around the world, this has been done in dozens of cultures, food preference tastes have been done. And these food preference tastes have universally shown that in every culture, people prefer foods that are laden with fats. That doesn't mean that there are some people that don't prefer foods that are primarily carbohydrate or protein, but it means if you collect the data from everyone, on average, the preference is for fatty foods. In fact, the way the preference goes looks like this. People prefer food, their preference as it has more sugar, so carbohydrates, goes up to a point and then it starts to drop off. So we do have a preference for sweet things, but it's a complicated shape. On the other hand, when foods are created that have increasing amounts of fat, if you add more fat to it, people prefer it more. If you add more fat to it, people prefer it more. If you add more fat to it, people prefer it more. If you add more fat to it, people prefer it more. There doesn't seem to be an end to it. The more fat you can stick in it, the more people like it. If you add a little bit of sweetness to it, that helps out up to a point, but then it stops helping out. I think about this all the time because even though I don't cook a lot, every now and then I'll cook. And if I have people coming over and I'm making food, I have a much different strategy than when I'm making food for myself, where I'll take chicken and I'll just boil it in water and I'll add lemon or something like that. If I have people coming over, I want them to like me and I want them to have a good time. So how do I prepare my food? I think about this chart all the time. Any way that I can cram more fat onto the food, I do. And they have the chicken, let's say it's chicken. They're like, God, this is really good. How come your chicken tastes so much better than mine? And the odds are I've been marinating it in something that is complete fat. I've cooked it in something that's complete fat. I've done everything I can to get the fat in there. I try and then, tap it off with paper towels so they don't see it and they just think it tastes good. But I don't use margarine. I don't, you add butter for everything you can, and people will love you for a while. So going back to this food preference thing, we want to answer the question, why is it that people have these preferences? And for this, we have to think from an evolutionary perspective. Ancestral humans may have varied in their taste preferences. In other words, there might be some people, and I have this up, this is a picture from a hunter-gatherer society, the Kung San in South Africa, and we might imagine that some of them prefer food that's laden in carbohydrates, some prefer proteins, some prefer fats. So as we wrote in Mean Genes, you have to think about the environment. I talked about this last time. We spent the majority of our evolutionary history as hunter-gatherers. Now, the difference between carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, and I'll talk about carbs and proteins in a minute, you can learn from reading the labels of your food, right? And we know this. How many calories are there in a gram of carbohydrates? 4. It's on the label. How many calories are there in a gram of protein? 4. How many calories are there in a gram of fat? 9. It's hard to wrap your head around that. It weighs the same amount. One of them has lots more energy in it. It's the equivalent of, I think I left all my money at home today because I keep giving it away to you, so I didn't bring it. But it's the equivalent of having a green rectangle, right, that we can use to do things that require energy, money. But that green rectangle that you have might have 100 written in every corner, or it might say 1 in every corner. It's the same shape. It weighs the same amount. One of them can do a whole lot more work than the other, right? Which do you prefer? I prefer the hundreds. And that's what's going on with fats here. From the perspective of an organism that needs energy to do the things like reproduction, growth, avoidance of predators, finding a mate, all those things, you need energy. So when you consume food, if food is not unlimited, if you have to look for it and you don't know if you're going to find enough, you want to home in on the stuff that's going to give you the most bang for your buck. That's why if you have the preference for fats, let's say we come upon some tree right here. And she's picking these nuts that are called mongongo nuts. And mongongo nuts, like most nuts, have tons of fat in them. Now you can either eat, X amount of grams of the mongongo nuts, or you can eat the same amount of the leaves. The leaves are a lot of carbohydrates. But for the same amount, you're going to get much more energy if you consume the nuts. And so imagine that there are individuals who differ in their preference for those. I always like to think about this. 4 ounces of carbohydrates gives you 450 calories. If you consume 4 ounces of protein, it's also 450 calories. But 4 ounces of fat, 1,000 calories. We view this in a very twisted way, right? We think, wow, that's bad. We got to avoid those. But I want you to think only in terms of ancestral humans, the world we spent most of our evolutionary history in. If you run out of food and there's some sort of shortage of food, a famine that goes on for a while, you have to ask the question that we asked in Mean Genes, who's less likely to starve? The person who's been consuming the fats. We said fatties. Who's likely to leave more offspring? The people who aren't dead. Who are they? Fatties. Finally, who are your ancestors? They're the people who didn't die, right? Your grandmother and grandfather had to reach an age where they can reproduce. And so in each of these cases, you have to imagine there's variation in what people prefer. Some prefer fats, some don't. It's heritable. Natural selection has 3 necessary and sufficient conditions, right, to occur. It's been a while since I asked about them. What's the third one? Differential reproductive success. So if you live in a world where people are dying in famines all the time, the ones who have packed on the most fat when food was plentiful are going to be the ones that make it through. And so that's why we expect that all of us have ancestors that survived all the famines. All of us had the ancestors who had the preference for fats. So any species that has evolved under conditions of food shortages, we would expect to have a fat preference. And we can take this as the take-home message that it's shaped our food preferences, making us love energetically rich fats. You would expect this to be true in rodents as well. And if you do these same experiments where you give them little petri dishes with either carbohydrate-laden food or fat or proteins, same preference. They all prefer the fatty foods. If you do it with primates, same result. And so you can think of taste preferences as evolution's way of building us with a homing device. We want to home in on the food types that are most likely to give us energy that will allow us to survive at a higher rate and reproduce at a higher rate than other individuals in the population. Now, why is it that we're all so sort of twisted now and we think of fats as bad? Because what? We have a lot of food around. Or, in a word, an important word to me that I introduced a week ago, but one word captures the essence of this situation. Why all of our ancestors would have evolved to prefer fats, and all of us fear fats. Mismatch. Remember? We live in a world now that is not the same as the world we evolved in because we have come up with some very clever ideas, namely agriculture and industrial means of distribution of food, so that you can walk to Westwood and you wouldn't even have to walk to Westwood, but within probably 100 yards from here, you could sit and you could consume an infinite number of calories every day, forever. But our brain, after spending 99% of our evolutionary history in the context of there's not enough food, it could run out at any point, has us thinking, have to eat as much as I can, have to eat as much as I can, have to eat as much as I can. That's the winning strategy, or that has been the winning strategy all the way up until now. And so it's only now that our instincts are bad. People say all the time, and it kills me, these self-help books say, oh, trust your instincts. Instincts are things that have evolved over a long period of time. If the world changes suddenly, your instinct is exactly the wrong thing to trust. Your instinct will get you into trouble, unless you're a hunter-gatherer. Another case relating to, sorry, these are just more pictures of the Kung San. Not only does food run out all the time for them, they have to walk around a lot looking for it. On average, they walk about 12 miles a day. Here we have another society. They're not hunter-gatherers. These are the Yanomamo you'll read a lot about. So they're one of the first groups that has agriculture. They have these little gardens of plantains. These are the Maasai in Africa, East Africa. And in all these cases, South Africa, the Kung San, the Yanomamo of South America, the Maasai here, they've got these villages where they have lots of cattle. Every one of those societies, whether they have access to lots of fats or protein or not, still has the same taste preferences. So here's that orangutan that we write about, Chontek, in Mean Genes. Chontek was born in the Atlanta Zoo, grew up there. There's this woman, Lynn Miles, who took care of him, would feed him from bottles. And Chontek shows us that you don't have to be human to have a preference for fatty foods. She taught him sign language, and he would do, he had about 150 different signs, I think it was, eventually. And what else? He does artwork. I meant to go there this morning. He has a website where you can buy his art. He actually takes crayons and paintbrushes and does stuff. Anyway, she's cared for him like her kid her whole life. But one of the big problems is that in the wild, orangutans weigh about 160, 170, approximately what I weigh. Chontek weighed about 500 pounds. And they're not meant to have all this fat around their face. And this was a real problem, and so the doctors at the Atlanta Zoo said, hey, this is a bad idea. We've got to put him on a diet. So they put him on a diet. He got very angry. We wrote about it. It was kind of comical, but very sad that he would just do the sign language sign for candy over and over again. And he stopped doing. She would give him crayons to do his paintings. He would eat the crayons. She would... what else? She would try and get him to do these other things that he would do, and all he wanted to do in the games where he would push little buttons that indicated he could put together sentences, all he would do is push the button for Happy Meal, which is one of his favorite things. And it was very sad. The diet got him down to about 400 pounds, but the entire time he was on the diet, he was really angry and unhappy. And it's very much like what happens with humans, that when you try to lose weight, you've got all of these evolved emotions and feelings of hunger telling you, I'm a hunter-gatherer, food could run out, got to get some food. And when you fight against that, it shows you how powerful evolution is. It's built those feelings in you. And so it makes it very hard then for us or for Chontek to lose weight. There's another very fat and another one. Any orangutan that you look at in a zoo, guess what? They're fat. They're overweight. There are no orangutans in the wild ever that exceed 180 pounds. There are no orangutans that you'll find in a zoo that don't. And so the problem here, what's the problem? It's one word. It's an important word. Mismatch. Yes. Suddenly the orangutans live in a world where food gets delivered to them. Happy Meals. They're given signs, candy. Oh, if I do this with my hand, they bring candy to me. That's mismatch. It doesn't happen in the world they've evolved in. And when you have mismatch, you have instincts that lead to bad outcomes. And so that's what's happened with, in the case of Chontek, is that you end up with this bad outcome. With lots and lots of other species, same thing happens. You put an animal in the zoo where you deliver food to it every day and you restrict the amount of movement it can do, you end up with fat animals. So I look at pictures all the time because I'm interested in photography, and it's considered cheating if you're a wildlife photographer. Let's say you want to get a picture for your textbook of a zebra or let's say a giraffe, something like that. It's considered kind of cheating if you go to the zoo and you get your zoom lens and you take a picture. You can get a great picture of them, but it's really easy to do, and so they want to have them taken in the wild. I can tell them apart usually because if the animal looks really, really healthy and fat, it's a zoo shot. If they look a little scraggly and not particularly overweight, it's probably from the wild. All right, let's talk about macromolecule number 2, carbohydrates. To the extent that lipids are for storage, they've got those hydrocarbon tails that store lots of energy. Carbohydrates' primary function is fuel. They're for energy now. They're not saving it up for a rainy day. They're for the general walking around, thinking, writing, talking, all the basic things you do. I've got this little kid here having an ice cream cone. Ice cream has some lipids in it, or we like it more the more lipids it has. But it's a lot of carbohydrates. In fact, the whole advent of gourmet ice cream was when people realized, hey, we can start cramming more and more fat into our ice cream. People like it more. Guess what kind of desserts I serve when I have people over? Yeah, I'm not serving yogurt. Carbohydrates tend to look like this. See, they're slightly different from the molecules before where it was just CH2, CH2, CH2. These all have an oxygen. And so if you were to count up all the C's and H's and O's, it turns out to be a ratio of approximately CH2O. So it might be 6C6, H12, O6, but for every H2O, there is a C. Sometimes they're in straight lines. Sometimes they are circular. Both of these are glucose, same molecule, but it just loops around on itself and connects back up. Beta just has to do with which direction one of the molecules is. You know, you can have the OHs up or you can have them down. We don't have to worry about that. But you can have the same molecule tinkering around in different ways. These OH and H bonds connected to the C's, they break down a lot more easily than the CH2s of lipids. That's why if you consume something that has carbohydrates, they can be broken down very quickly for fuel. Our carbohydrates are broken down into two groups. We have monosaccharides and polysaccharides. Monosaccharides are sugars that this has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 carbons, anywhere from about 3 to 7 carbons. And polysaccharides are connections of individual monosaccharides all together. And so you can have, people tend, and I don't like when they do this, they tend to call monosaccharides sugar, and they will call polysaccharides starch, and they'll use words that are not sugar. They're all sugars. But it tends to just be kind of preference that you'll define a starch or polysaccharide as something like this. It's glucose connected to glucose connected to glucose. Question. How do you make artificial sweetener? That's a good one. It's not at all what you would think. Kind of running out of time here. NutraSweet is I think one of the more interesting ones. It turns out to have no carbohydrates in it at all. We'll see that proteins, the last thing on our list here, are you have amino acids, these tiny molecules. There are 20 different ones. And proteins are amino acid connected to amino acid, connected to amino acid, and you'll build up long chains. Artificial sweeteners, in the case of NutraSweet, happen to be 2 amino acids that are joined together. And when you put them together, their molecules stick out in just such a way that on your tongue, they stimulate the carbohydrate receptors. So it has no sugar in it. It's actually a protein. And those two amino acids, if they come apart, doesn't taste sweet at all. So in the case of starch would be things like potatoes, cream of wheat, pasta. And what you could say is this, that whether you have individual molecules of simple sugars or monosaccharides like glucose, there also is fructose is one that you'd hear about commonly. There are a few others. The monosaccharides are very easy to break down, so if you put them into, you drink a glass of orange juice that has lots of simple sugars in it, you get fast energy, and it's readily available. Polysaccharides, on the other hand, you've got this and this and this, but in order to get the energy from that glucose, first you have to chop that bond. Then you have to chop that bond. Then you have to chop that bond. After you do that, then you can break down the glucose and you can get the energy from it. When I was first starting graduate school, I know it's a terrible cliche, but I was really a starving graduate student. I had very, very little money, and so I was always limited on the amount of food I had. And I discovered, again, this was sort of accidental. I didn't know much chemistry. But I discovered in my apartment, I was living in this horrible apartment in New Haven, and I would have to walk across New Haven to the library, and it was a long walk, and so if I was going there to sit in the library, I didn't want to have to come back and get food. I found that I could buy boxes of cream of wheat. You had cream of wheat before? It's just like gooey paste. And I would make maybe 3 servings of it, and I would have it in this bowl, and it was like eating wallpaper paste or paper mache. But I would eat it, and I noticed that then I would go to the library, and I would start studying, and I would stay there for 6, 7, 8, 9 hours without thinking about food. And for me, this was amazing, because I tend to think about food all the time. And I thought, wow, I don't know what this is, this cream of wheat, but it's really good. And I started finding out that in the case of a lot of pasta and bagels as well, I was having that same response. And it caused me to ponder this question, because I also love cereal like Captain Crunch. Captain Crunch is primarily monosaccharides. Monosaccharides can very quickly be broken down into sugar, and then you use them, and then they're gone. And a couple hours later, you're hungry. With the case of bagels, or cream of wheat, or potatoes here, these starches, or complex carbohydrates, or polysaccharides, all the words mean more or less the same. You put them in your body, and you don't have the energy immediately. Instead, you got to break them down. So with that cream of wheat, what was happening was, I eat it, my body chops some of those bonds between the simple sugars, they get released, I use those for energy. My body chops some more, they're available for energy. My body chops them some more, and so on. An interesting trick you can do is this. Get a bagel. I want you to do this experiment, because you won't believe that it's cool till you do it. Get a bagel, just a plain bagel, take a bite of it, and leave it in your mouth. On your tongue, your body produces enzymes that break down complex carbohydrates in your mouth. They're in your saliva. So if you let it sit there, this polysaccharide, all these individual units of glucose, are going to get broken down. So you have to sit there for 10, 15 minutes with the bagel on your tongue. But you'll notice this. The bagel that initially tastes like packing material, all of a sudden it gets sweet. And that sweetness is, a glucose got released. And it stimulates the taste bud that is for sugar. Are you laughing because that's cool or because it's stupid? Just try it. I guarantee you'll have one of your friends try it. So the longer you let it sit there, the more sweetness you get. And that's because you're breaking it down. Well, your body is doing that if you just eat it in your stomach as well. And so before you go to study, you should focus on complex carbohydrates because they will allow you to not think about food longer. So carbohydrates give us easily accessible energy. Shoot, I'm running out of time. I want to talk about caloric restriction. I think what I'll do is I'm going to hold off until next time on that topic, because I got to move ahead to proteins. Yes. So if I don't talk about caloric restriction next time, remind me. All right, so the last of the biological macromolecules we'll talk about. Oh, I have this picture here because plant material also contains some complex carbohydrates or polysaccharides. Cellulose. Cellulose forms a wall around every plant cell, and it looks like starch that you would find in a potato, except that the bond that connects this glucose to this one, to this one, to this one, instead of going like that, it goes up and then down. They're in a different orientation, and it would seem really trivial. And from a chemistry perspective, it is trivial. It's like, all right, they're polysaccharides. However, when you put cellulose into your body, we don't have enzymes that can hold on to the molecule and rip them apart one by one to make the glucose available. So if you consume cellulose, what happens? It moves through your body, moves through your body, moves through your body. You eliminate it. Did I really just point to my butt? Sorry. So cellulose would be a non-digestible carbohydrate. You can eat it, but you can't break it down, so you don't get any of the energy from it. And I'll talk about fiber, hopefully, at a later point, that even though you can't extract any energy from it, it's still useful in your diet. Oh, so this was for my caloric restriction. Sorry, we can't talk about fat mice. All right, let's talk about proteins. Muscles, building skin, building all the parts of your body, the structures. Yes, the strings on the tennis racket are made mostly from collagen, which would be the most common protein in your body. Here's how they're made. I told you they have this basic unit, AA stands for amino acid, that has a carbon again, but it's attached to something called a carboxyl group, COOH. Then it's attached to a hydrogen. Then over here it's attached to a nitrogen and a couple of hydrogens. And then up here I have R. R stands not for a specific molecule, but for something. Something gets attached there. There are 20 different amino acids. And each one is the same with respect to the amino group, the carboxyl group, and the hydrogen. But they've got something different up there. And that's how all the amino acids differ from each other. You'll notice that this is the first molecule that we've looked at that contains nitrogen. A lot of the stuff you build in your body has nitrogen. And so if you're only consuming carbohydrates and lipids, you don't get the nitrogen, you can't build those tissues. If you're a bodybuilder, you're someone working out a lot, you have to really focus on proteins because it's the only way you're going to get nitrogen. If you're growing plants, in order for them to add any tissue, they need nitrogen. There are a million different fertilizers that you'll see in a garden store to help your plants grow. They're all more or less the same. They are nitrogen. The more nitrogen you add to fertilizer to give available to plants, the bigger they can get. With a bodybuilder, the more nitrogen you can cram into them, the bigger they get. So that's the important one there. So here's how proteins get made. You take one amino acid, so here's the C. This was that other group. It's not exactly the same, COOH. You got rid of an OH because you want to connect it to the next one. But it's more or less, this is the carboxyl group. This is the amino group. Here's the H. And then you've got something up there. So it might be valine. If it was just, I forget what this R would be. It would be like CH3. Or it might be phenylalanine. But a protein is a sequence of amino acid, amino acid, amino acid, and you might have 1,000 of them. Or you might have something like hemoglobin, which has maybe 200 amino acids. But hemoglobin actually has one chain that's 200 amino acids long, another that's 200 long, and then you have another that two more that are also about 200 amino acids long, and they're all stuck together in some conglomeration. But all the different proteins of the world are going to be slightly different depending on what is the sequence. So it's like our alphabet has letters, and there are some letters, but you can put them together in an infinite number of combinations, and they make different structures. That's what proteins are. That's why, to me, it's one of the big letdowns of food labeling. When I look at it, it says, here's how much protein it is. But it doesn't tell me what kind of protein. It might be protein that's got lots of valine, or it might be protein that has lots of phenylalanine, or it might be protein that doesn't have any phenylalanine at all. So these are two of them. There are 20. Here's a question for you. I told you that NutraSweet is made by having 2 amino acids stuck together. Well, there are 20 amino acids. Guess what one of the 2 amino acids in NutraSweet is? Think about the label on Diet Coke. Phenylalanine. Warning, people who have PKU, this has phenylalanine. Like, aha. So NutraSweet has that, and it has another one, and that's what causes it to be sweet. There's a question here. Your hair is made up from protein. Fat is as well. Feathers in birds are made up of proteins. They can have all sorts of different colors. We have blood cells. Hemoglobin is a protein. So with hair, here we have our picture again, remember, of Claudia and Theodore's hair. His is really brittly and curly. Hers is mostly straight. The question is, it's both protein. Hair is protein. And so you look at different people. Here's one of Nicole Kidman. She has curly hair, although you look at her frequently and she'll have straightened it. Why is it that if it's just protein, in some cases it's curly and in other cases it's not? And that you can change it. I want you to look in your book, in the chapters 2 and 3 of the textbook. They talk about how proteins tend to have their shape and what it's related to. So I want you to think about that one. So we have our last take-home message here. It says this: cells and tissues are primarily built from proteins, which are sequences of amino acids. The last thing I want to go through here, I've written down exam results. You all should have seen your exam score already on your My UCLA page. Here's what it looked like. The average was, out of 150, was 108 plus or minus 17, so 72%. Very happy with that. High score was 144. Low score was 55. If I were to give grades based on your performance on this, I want you to know more or less where you stand. I'd say this. I'd say that if you're about 121 or so, these are approximate up to 150, I'd say you're in the A or A minus range. However, the bad news, if you're at 121, you're also in the B range. So from about 105 to 121 would be the B range. C range goes down to about 73. And below 73, you're in the D to F range. Your TAs are going to have your exams. They'll bring them outside, and they'll hand them back to you. If you don't want to get them now, you can pick them up in section. That'll be it for today. Don't forget, I have office hours if you want to stop by.